For decades, Linux has existed as the ultimate symbol of digital freedom. Anyone, anywhere in the world, could download an operating system, modify it, share it, improve it, and redistribute it without asking permission from a corporation. That freedom is exactly why Linux became the backbone of the internet. The cloud, supercomputers, Android phones, smart TVs, cars, satellites, and even military systems. But now, a new wave of legislation being discussed in the United States is creating panic across the open-source world. Developers, privacy advocates, and Linux communities are warning that a single law, or combination of new regulations, could fundamentally change how Linux distributions operate in America. Some are even saying it could wipe out more than 600 Linux distros entirely. At first, that sounds impossible. Linux is decentralized. No single company owns it. No government can simply delete Linux from existence. But the fear is not that Linux itself disappears. The fear is that regulations targeting cybersecurity, software liability, encryption, artificial intelligence, export controls, and digital identity verification could make it legally or financially impossible for small Linux distributions to survive. And when you look closer, the concerns suddenly stop sounding like conspiracy theories and start sounding dangerously realistic. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how fragile most Linux distributions actually are. People often imagine Linux as this giant, unstoppable ecosystem competing directly with Microsoft and Apple. But the truth is that most Linux distributions are maintained by tiny volunteer teams. Some are run by only 2 or 3 developers. Others survive purely on donations. Many privacy-focused distros operate with almost no budget at all. These projects are built by passionate individuals working late nights after their regular jobs. They do not have legal departments. They do not have compliance officers. They do not have massive cybersecurity insurance policies. And if a new law suddenly demands expensive certification requirements, mandatory security audits, liability guarantees, or strict identity verification for software maintainers, hundreds of these projects could disappear almost overnight. The controversy exploded after lawmakers began discussing stronger accountability rules for software providers following years of massive cyber attacks across the United States. Major incidents involving ransomware, infrastructure breaches, and supply chain attacks pushed governments to rethink how software is regulated. The logic from lawmakers seems straightforward. If insecure software can damage hospitals, banks, pipelines, and government systems, then software creators should bear more responsibility for security failures. On paper, that sounds reasonable. But open-source communities argue that lawmakers fundamentally misunderstand how Linux ecosystems work. Unlike commercial operating systems, Linux distributions are collaborative projects built from thousands of separate components maintained by people all over the world. One distro may contain packages from hundreds of independent developers. If new laws impose liability for vulnerabilities, who becomes responsible when something breaks? Is it the distro maintainer? The kernel developer? The volunteer who packaged a library? The student who contributed code 3 years ago? Suddenly, the entire open-source model becomes legally dangerous. This fear intensified when cybersecurity agencies started discussing software duty of care principles. These proposals suggest software providers could be legally expected to follow strict security practices or face consequences if their software contributes to attacks. Large corporations like Microsoft, Google, Red Hat, and Canonical might survive under such rules because they have money and legal teams, but small Linux distributions would face an impossible challenge. Imagine a niche distro maintained by 4 volunteers suddenly needing compliance audits, documentation systems, penetration testing, legal registration, and ongoing certification processes. That distro would likely shut down instantly. And it gets even more complicated when encryption enters the conversation. Some lawmakers have proposed tighter controls around anonymous communication systems, encrypted platforms, and privacy-focused software tools. Linux distributions that specialize in anonymity and privacy could become direct targets under future regulations. Distros like Tails, Cubes OS, Honix, and others exist specifically to maximize user privacy and security. Governments argue that strong anonymity tools can also help criminals evade law enforcement. Privacy advocates argue the opposite, that privacy is essential for journalists, activists, whistleblowers, and ordinary citizens. But if regulations begin treating advanced privacy tools as suspicious or heavily restricted technologies, Certain Linux projects could face enormous legal pressure. Then there's the issue of software signing and digital identity verification. Several policy proposals have discussed requiring software maintainers to verify their real-world identities before distributing software packages. The goal is to improve supply chain security by making it harder for anonymous attackers to inject malicious code. Again, the idea sounds logical at first glance, but open-source communities warn this could destroy one of Linux's greatest strengths: decentralized global collaboration. Many developers contribute anonymously for personal safety reasons. Others live in countries where political conditions make anonymity essential. If contributors are forced to publicly identify themselves to distribute code legally in the United States, countless developers may simply stop participating. Some experts believe the real danger isn't one giant law, but dozens of smaller regulations stacking on top of each other until small Linux projects collapse under the burden. One law adds compliance paperwork, another introduces liability concerns, another restricts encryption exports, another mandates vulnerability disclosure timelines, another requires identity verification. Large enterprise Linux vendors adapt because they have money. Small community distros vanish because they cannot keep up. The scary part is that this trend is already visible in other industries. Regulations intended to improve safety often end up benefiting giant corporations while crushing smaller competitors. Large companies can afford compliance. Small independent creators cannot. Critics fear the same thing could happen to Linux. Instead of an ecosystem with hundreds of creative experimental distributions, America could end up with only a handful of heavily regulated corporate-approved Linux systems. That possibility terrifies longtime Linux users because diversity is one of Linux's greatest strengths. Different distributions exist for different purposes. Some focus on security, some focus on old hardware, some focus on education. Others focus on accessibility, customization, gaming, scientific computing, or privacy. The ecosystem thrives because experimentation is allowed. If legal pressure wipes out smaller projects, Linux could lose much of the innovation that made it powerful in the first place. What makes this story even more dramatic is that Linux already dominates critical infrastructure. Most of the internet runs on Linux servers. Cloud platforms rely heavily on Linux. Financial systems, stock exchanges, telecommunications networks, and data centers depend on it. Even many government systems run Linux internally. If regulations unintentionally destabilize open-source ecosystems, the consequences could extend far beyond hobbyist desktop users. Developers are especially worried about how software liability laws might affect package maintainers. Package maintainers are the invisible backbone of Linux distributions. They compile software, test dependencies, push updates, and ensure compatibility across systems. Yet many maintainers are unpaid volunteers. If maintainers become legally exposed whenever vulnerabilities emerge, many will walk away immediately. Open-source software evolves rapidly, and vulnerabilities are inevitable in any large ecosystem. Holding volunteers legally responsible for every future exploit could create impossible risks. Another major concern involves artificial intelligence regulations. AI is becoming deeply integrated into operating systems, development tools, and cybersecurity systems. Some proposed laws require transparency, auditing, and monitoring for AI-powered software systems. If Linux distributions incorporate AI features, they may suddenly fall under new regulatory frameworks. Once again, enterprise vendors may survive while smaller projects struggle to comply. Meanwhile, export control laws are becoming another flashpoint. Advanced encryption technologies, cybersecurity tools, and penetration testing software often face export restrictions. Many Linux distributions include tools that could theoretically be classified as dual-use technologies. Security-focused distros frequently bundle network analysis tools, forensic utilities, or penetration testing frameworks. Governments worry these tools can be used offensively by hostile actors. But cybersecurity professionals rely on them defensively every day. If regulations tighten further, some Linux distributions could face restrictions simply because of the tools they include by default. Then there's the App Store problem. Modern operating systems are increasingly moving toward centralized software distribution models. Apple's ecosystem is tightly controlled. Microsoft is moving toward stronger platform security restrictions. Some lawmakers support more centralized trust models to reduce malware distribution. Linux historically rejected this approach by remaining open and decentralized. But future regulations could pressure operating systems toward curated repositories with strict approval processes. That could fundamentally reshape how Linux works. The open source community also fears that corporate lobbying may influence future regulations. Large technology companies often support rules they can afford to follow, because those rules eliminate smaller competitors. If compliance costs rise high enough, only major corporate Linux vendors remain. Independent community distributions disappear. Critics argue that this would effectively corporatize Linux in America. What's ironic is that Linux became successful precisely because it avoided these barriers. Students could build distros from dorm rooms. Developers could fork projects freely. Communities could experiment without permission. The low barrier to entry created explosive innovation. Many famous Linux technologies began as tiny side projects. Under a heavily regulated future, some of those projects might never have survived long enough to matter. Cybersecurity experts themselves are divided on the issue. Some argue stronger regulations are necessary because modern software insecurity has become a national security threat. Supply chain attacks are real. Critical infrastructure vulnerabilities are real. Ransomware attacks are real. Governments want accountability because insecure systems can literally shut down hospitals or pipelines. But others warn that overregulation could backfire catastrophically by reducing transparency and weakening collaborative security research. Open source advocates argue that Linux is actually more secure because its code is publicly inspectable. Vulnerabilities can be discovered and fixed by anyone. Restricting open collaboration could reduce the number of eyes reviewing code. In other words, attempts to improve security might unintentionally weaken it. The debate also reveals a deeper philosophical clash about the future of computing itself. One vision favors centralized, tightly controlled, identity-verified digital ecosystems. The other favors decentralized, open, permissionless innovation. Linux has always represented the second philosophy. That's why so many people view these proposed laws as more than just technical regulations. They see them as part of a larger battle over who controls computing. Some Linux users are already preparing contingency plans. Developers discuss hosting infrastructure outside the United States. Others talk about decentralized distribution methods resistant to legal pressure. Privacy-focused communities are experimenting with peer-to-peer package systems and distributed hosting networks. Some believe the Linux ecosystem will simply migrate away from American control if regulations become too aggressive. But relocation is not easy. The United States remains a major center for cloud infrastructure, software development, and technology investment. American regulations often influence global standards because companies operating internationally adopt U.S. compliance frameworks worldwide. If America imposes strict open-source regulations, the effects could spread internationally. There's also growing concern about how younger developers may react. Open-source development traditionally thrived because it was accessible and informal. Teenagers could contribute code anonymously. Students could experiment freely. If software development becomes heavily regulated and legally risky, many future contributors may never get involved at all. The chilling effect could reshape the next generation of innovation. Interestingly, some lawmakers appear unaware of the scale of the Linux ecosystem they are affecting. Many policy discussions focus primarily on commercial software companies without fully understanding how community-driven software operates. Open-source advocates have repeatedly warned policymakers that treating volunteer software projects like billion-dollar corporations could devastate the ecosystem unintentionally. The number 600-plus Linux distros keeps appearing in discussions because there are hundreds upon hundreds of active Linux distributions today. Many are tiny, specialized projects serving niche communities. Some exist purely for education. Others preserve older hardware from becoming electronic waste. Some focus entirely on accessibility for disabled users. Others help people escape surveillance-heavy commercial ecosystems. Losing these projects would mean losing enormous diversity and creativity. At the same time, not everyone agrees that the fears are justified. Some experts believe Linux communities are overreacting. They argue that governments are primarily targeting commercial vendors and critical infrastructure operators, not hobbyist operating systems. Others point out that open-source software is too deeply embedded into global infrastructure to regulate aggressively without causing economic chaos. They believe lawmakers will eventually carve out exemptions for community projects. But skeptics respond with a simple question. What happens if lawmakers don't fully understand what they are regulating until it's too late? History is full of examples where broad laws created unintended consequences for technology ecosystems. Regulations written for one purpose often affect unrelated communities in unexpected ways. Linux developers worry they may become collateral damage in a broader war over cybersecurity, digital identity, and online control. And there's another uncomfortable reality. Governments worldwide are becoming increasingly interested in controlling digital infrastructure. From internet regulation to AI governance to encryption debates, states are asserting more authority over technology ecosystems than ever before. Linux, by its very nature, resists centralized control. That makes it politically complicated in an era increasingly focused on regulation and oversight. The timing also matters. Linux desktop adoption has been quietly growing. Frustration with Windows telemetry, subscription models, AI integration, advertising, and hardware restrictions pushed more users toward Linux alternatives. Steam Deck gaming improvements brought new attention to Linux gaming. Privacy concerns drove users toward open-source systems. For the first time in years, Linux momentum appeared stronger than expected. That's part of why these legal fears feel so dramatic right now. Many users feel Linux is finally entering the mainstream, just as new regulations threaten to reshape everything. Some developers warn that if small Linux distributions disappear, innovation could stagnate. Experimental projects often pioneer ideas later adopted by larger systems. Community-driven environments test radical concepts that corporations initially ignore. Without that experimentation layer, operating systems could become more uniform, more corporate, and less user-controlled. Others worry about concentration of power. If only a few enterprise Linux vendors survive future compliance environments, users may become increasingly dependent on corporate ecosystems again. One of Linux's greatest strengths has always been user choice. Overregulation could reduce that choice dramatically. Yet despite all the fear, many Linux veterans remain optimistic. Open-source communities survived corporate wars before. They survived lawsuits, patent battles, licensing conflicts, and commercial competition. Linux itself was once dismissed as a hobbyist experiment that would never threaten Microsoft. Today, it powers most of the digital world. Supporters believe the ecosystem will adapt again if necessary. Some argue these threats may even strengthen decentralized development models. If centralized hosting becomes legally risky, developers may accelerate peer-to-peer collaboration systems. If package repositories face regulation, new decentralized distribution technologies may emerge. Open-source communities historically respond to pressure with innovation. Still, the uncertainty is real. Nobody fully knows what future regulations will look like or how aggressively they will be enforced, and uncertainty alone can damage smaller projects. Developers may leave preemptively rather than risk legal exposure later. Donations may decline if users fear projects are unstable. Communities can collapse from fear even before laws officially arrive. In many ways, this entire controversy exposes how much modern civilization depends on invisible volunteer labor. Huge portions of global infrastructure rely on open-source projects maintained by tiny groups of unpaid developers. Yet governments are only beginning to grapple with the implications of regulating those ecosystems. The tension between security, accountability, freedom, and innovation has no easy solution. And maybe that's the biggest reason this story matters far beyond Linux users. The battle over Linux regulation is really a battle over the future shape of the digital world itself. Will computing remain open, decentralized, and community-driven? Or will it evolve into a tightly regulated environment dominated by large corporations and state-approved systems? Right now, nobody knows the answer. But one thing is becoming clear. The future of Linux in America may depend not only on technology, but on politics, law, and the philosophical struggle over who controls software in the first place. Because once regulations begin deciding who is allowed to build operating systems, who can contribute anonymously, what tools may be distributed, and what risks volunteers must accept, Linux stops being just software. It becomes a test case for the future of digital freedom itself.